Welcome to the final lesson of this series on In the Beginning, looking at the first 11 chapters of Genesis. The first 5 chapters of Genesis detailed the creation of the world and the immediate downfall of humanity. God created the cosmos and everything in it, as well as the earth and everything living on it, and humans in his image, pronouncing everything very good. Adam and Eve were tempted and sinned in the Garden of Eden, leading to the introduction of death and dysfunction, and then the first murder. In Genesis 5, we saw the genealogy from Adam to Noah, emphasizing the long spans of the early patriarchs and showing that death reigned from Adam to Moses. Chapters 6 through 10 told about Noah and the flood, covering humanity's extreme corruption, God's judgment with the deluge, and the subsequent covenant of grace. Noah, a righteous man, obeyed God by building an ark to save his family and representative animals. After the flood, God promised never to destroy the earth again, marking that with a rainbow. In chapter 10, we saw the table of nations, the genealogy of Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who became the ancestors of the nations that repopulated the earth after the flood. In our last lesson in this series, we looked at the event that caused the dispersion, the plan to build the Tower of Babel. And that's what we're going to look at in the beginning of chapter 11. We will then transition from this event to a genealogy tracing Shem's descendants to Abram, concluding with Terah moving his family, including Abram and Sarai, towards Canaan. This painting, by the way, is by Lucas van Valkenborg, and it's in the Louvre. It was painted in 1594, depicting the Tower of Babel. If we're going to have an outline of Genesis 11, I think it falls into these 3 sections fairly easily. God confused the people's languages at Babel, verses 1 through 9. Then we have Shem's descendants from verses 10 down to 26. And then it focuses in on Terah's family in verses 27 to 32. Well, let's begin by reading through Genesis chapter 11, the first 9 verses and into verse 10. The whole earth had a common language and a common vocabulary. When the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They had brick instead of stone and tar instead of mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered across the face of the entire earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people had started building. And the Lord said, "If as one people, all sharing a common language, they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be beyond them. Come, let's go down and confuse their language so they won't be able to understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there across the face of the entire earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the entire world. And from there the Lord scattered them across the face of the entire earth. This is the account of Shem. This chapter goes back to the time before the people were scattered. There was only one language, literally one lip and one word, or one set of words. In other words, one vocabulary, one language. The people migrated from the east, or possibly eastward. The Hebrew's ambiguous at this point. It could mean either. Most translators believe that eastward is the better rendering. They migrated and they found a nice place to live in the land of Shinar, which we know that area better as Babylon. Jack Lewis, in his little book Understanding Genesis, wrote, "Shinar, the Bible, is equivalent to Sumer of history. The Sumerians founded the first civilization known to history." And he references Kramer's work on the Sumerians. This seems to be some from all three groupings of people that have migrated here. We have descendants of Shem and of Ham and of Japheth all together. And although these three were probably still living, if all three lived as long as Shem did, William Smith suggested that they were a large body of Noah's offspring who settled here, who had left Armenia where the ark touched down, that they were looking for possibly better soil and better climate. They decided to begin making a large settlement. So they started making bricks and firing them to make them stronger. Fired bricks are much stronger than sun-dried ones. Now, Bible Study Notes points out from the text there, the speech contains two cohortatives of exhortation, followed by their respective cognate accusatives. Let us brick bricks and burn for burning. This stresses the intensity of the undertaking. And the reason they made bricks was that this region lacked stone. So they used bitumen or pitch or tar or asphalt, depending on your translation, for mortar to hold the bricks together. And archaeology has confirmed that early construction in this area was of kiln-fired bricks and bitumen. The people decided to make a large settlement with a large tower. The tower was to be very high. And linking this back to chapter 10, it would seem that Nimrod was behind this, as he's the one we learned in the previous chapter. We learned that he was the one who built Babylon, and Babel is basically the same name and the same place. The purpose of the city and tower, we often hear it was to get to heaven. Makes that, because of their arrogance, maybe a logical interpretation. But the phrase to reach is not in the Hebrew text. The better translation is that they would build a tower unto heaven. In other words, that it would be a tower dedicated to heaven and to worship, and possibly the worship of the heavens. Some have suggested the possibility that they planned to build this very tall tower so that they would be safe in a future flood, forgetting God's promise signified in the rainbow. Henry Morris suggested that they may have thought they could recreate Eden, and they even named the two rivers in this area after two of the rivers that flowed from Eden, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This may be, possibly, maybe even probably, the introduction of polytheism into the world. It would seem that all the great polytheistic mythologies originated from what was practiced in Babylon. We see from the text that the reason they built this was so that they wouldn't be scattered, so they could all stay together. William Smith wrote, "Soon that idea sprang up in their minds, which has been the dream of every man in every age, a universal empire with a mighty city for its capital. In the blindness of their pride, they fancied that, when thus banded together, they might defy God himself and defeat his wise design of dispersing them over the earth." So the problem with their doing this was simple. God had told Noah and his family when they left the ark to go forth and populate the world. The sin was not in the building of the tower per se, but in not obeying God and not scattering throughout the earth. They were trying to make a name for themselves, and in doing so, they were intentionally rejecting God. Right across this statement, verses 3 and 4 show how totally they were focused on themselves. Let us, and lest we. In all their talk, there is no acknowledgement of God and His will. He is not mentioned as they focus exclusively on their desires and plans. God took note of what these people were doing. They were going against what He had told them to do. Notice that God does not go down for information. He goes down to institute judgment. Notice also this phrase here, let's go down, let us go down, which should bring to mind Genesis chapter 1, when God created man. Let us make man in our image. As it was not there and it's not here, God's not talking to angels. He's talking to here, to the rest of deity. Gordon Wenham in the Word Biblical Commentary says, with heavy irony, we now see the tower through God's eyes. The tower which man thought reached to heaven, God can hardly see. From the height of heaven, it seems insignificant. So the Lord must come down to look at it. God's descent to earth to view the tower is no more proof of the author's primitive anthropomorphic view of God, that is, God's asking Adam and Eve where they were hiding in the garden, as an indication of His ignorance. It is simply a brilliant and dramatic way of expressing the puniness of man's greatest achievements when set alongside the Creator's omnipotence. The problem was they were ignoring God. If this had been left unpunished, there was no telling what they would do. God proposed to confuse their language. No longer would they be able to communicate with each other, and building the city and tower would stop. Now, we're not told how the languages were confused. This is the beginning of different languages. And it was simply accomplished by the direct power of God. I get the impression that they went to sleep one night, all speaking the same language, but when they woke up, there were several languages being spoken. It sort of be like going to sleep as an English speaker and waking up, all you knew was French. And so communication became impossible. They left off with the building and scattered into different places, as chapter 10 has already told us. There is a mound, by the way, in Babylon known as Birs Nimrod, Nimrod's mound. Although there are no direct inscriptions or records in Babylon that mention Nimrod, the Arabs attribute all the great works of ancient times to a man named Nimrod, or Nimrod, as they spell it. Birs Nimrod is near Babylon. Tel Nimrod is near Baghdad. Sur el Nimrod is an ancient dam across the Tigris River. And the mound of Nimrod is near Mosul. Nimrod seems to feature there. And it would seem that Nimrod was possibly deified in the Babylonian god Marduk, their chief god. Babel, that's where Babylon comes from. Babylon is apparently the Greek form of Babel. But Babel was so named because this was the place where languages were confused and the people scattered. I'm not sure if it works as well in other languages, but it works very well in English because we understand what babbling is all about. Babel literally in Hebrew, though, is balel, and that word means division or confusion. Babel is Babylonian for gate of the gods. What humans thought would be the gate of the gods ended in confusion. God's purpose was once again being accomplished. The people were scattered into the far-flung reaches of the earth, as we saw in chapter 10. Some went into the more favorable regions, became great nations due to their great resources. Others ended up in some of the far-flung areas where their cultures developed. How long would all that take? Archaeologists are confirming that civilization appeared more or less at the same time throughout all the world in the recent past. This type of migration of small family groups to small niches and the inbreeding that would result for several generations could easily account for the racial characteristics that we have today, as within a very short time, distinctive characteristics would become dominant. Now, I suspect that not everybody was at Babel. I can't see Noah being there, nor Shem for that matter. We do know that a good number of them migrated down there. But that's not to say that everybody who had, as the families expanded, that everybody went. But there were a lot of them there. One more thing I think it's useful to point out. I don't know if you're familiar with mitochondrial Eve. This is the result of genetic studies of populations throughout the world, looking at the ancestors through women. I believe that comes down through the mitochondria. I could be wrong there. But those who are doing these studies have determined that all life on Earth today goes back to 3 women who were from one woman. And I think this so well matches what we find in Scripture. The one woman would, of course, be Eve. The 3 women would be the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Notice that these also are in 3 areas of the world, roughly corresponding to the areas that the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth settled. Now, the reason that there are 4 charts in this is that there was some intermingling of the groups and that they can't figure out exactly how much and how it happened. So they have sort of 4 suggestions there. I also wonder whether God split the people into 3 language groupings from which our languages have come. And were these 3 all different from the original language, which presumably those who are not at Babel continued to speak? I don't know. Henry Morris suggested that the original pre-flood language was a Semitic language, and possibly Hebrew itself, and that Shem and his line continued to speak this language. That could be, but we don't know one way or the other. We do find a principle in this text, which I believe holds true throughout the Bible. Edwin Jones expressed it this way: we learn from Babel that when men are working against God, they must be separated. The other side of this truth is that when men are working for God, they must be united. And he gives a couple references there. I quite liked that. In light of Israel's action in the wilderness, this was still a lesson that God's people needed to learn. Land is God's gift and cannot be seized without regard to him. The people of Babel tried to seize their own bit of land and make a name for themselves. But God said no. But think about this. Israel, when they arrived at the Promised Land the first time, were discouraged by the report of the 10 spies. They were told by God they would have to wander for 40 years before they could enter the land. But some decided to go and take the land themselves without God. And what happened? They were soundly defeated. I think we can see why it was important for Israel to be taught this incident as they were about to enter the Promised Land, to take it with God's help. Jim McGuigan comments, Moses would have Israel note what happened at Babel to self-made people who wanted to make a name for themselves and by themselves. People, ancient or modern, constantly need reminded that the power to bless is of God and not of themselves. At the beginning of verse 10, which I've included here in the text, we have another one of those colophons, indicating possibly that this is where Shem's recording ended. How long a time period was it from the end of the flood until the dispersion? Well, if we take the view that the division of the earth under Peleg was the dispersion, then it took place in the 5th generation after Noah. If Peleg was named for this incident, it had to take place around the time that he was born. This would be sometime around 100 years after the flood. This is, of course, assuming there are no missing generations. Now, keep in mind that this is an historical account of what happened after the flood. It isn't just a story made up to explain why we have different languages. Unlike the flood accounts, though, there are no Near Eastern parallels with this particular narrative. Although in the Sumerian epic En-Merkar and the Lord of Arata, there is a remembrance of a time when everyone spoke one language. This account is as important as the speaking in various languages by the power of the Spirit is in the New Testament. They're both important. G. Campbell Morgan said, necessarily belief in this story demands belief in the possibility of God's direct intervention in the affairs of men by what we sometimes speak of as supernatural methods. Any argument which is valid against the story of the confusion of tongues at Babel is equally valid against the account of the gift of tongues at Pentecost. These are linked together. Our next set of verses, we find the genealogy of the descendants of Shem. We saw their names in the last chapter. In verse 10, we find the last mention of the flood in Genesis. Shem fathered Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. And we can also see the lineage traced down to Abraham's father, Terah, through Eber and Peleg. And we can see that man's lifespan is getting shorter when you see how long these are living. In fact, to compare the two, on the left we've got before the flood, on the right the lifespan after the flood. Before the flood, the lifespan was normally just around 900 years. Now, there were 2 anomalies. I've got them marked there in the list. Enoch, who was taken by God and was only on the earth for 365 years. And Lamech, Noah's father, died in his 782nd year, just a few years before the flood. And so they are the 2 exceptions. But after the flood, we see Shem only living 600 years, so that's about 300 down from what was normal before the flood, and then the lifespan stepping down to the 400s, and then to the 200s, and finally into the 100 years. So that's definitely shortening. This is their lifespan graphed out. That's the bit in the green, not the bit in the blue. I'm just trying to cover up what was there. And again, you can see how long it was on the left of the line's where the flood was. And on the right, very much becoming a lot shorter. So we can see how after the flood, the time they lived decreased dramatically. We also see that the age of having children was also getting lower. From the birth of the firstborn being anywhere from the mid-60s to upper 100s before the flood, to primarily in the 30s after the flood, with a few notable exceptions. We also have another colophon. It would seem that all Terah recorded was the genealogy from Shem to his sons. We find from the dates given here that it was just 365 years from Arphaxad, son of Shem, to Abraham, which is not a significant amount of time considering how long they were still living. The last section. This is the account of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. Haran died in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans, while his father Terah was still alive. But Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. But Sarai was barren. She had no children. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and with them he set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. When they came to Canaan, they settled there. The lifetime of Terah was 205 years, and he died in Haran. This is all setting the stage for the new narrative, which will begin in the next chapter, which is centered on Abram, as he is in our text when we were introduced to him. We find that Haran was the father of Lot, but we also find that Haran died early. He died before Terah, and this seems to be unusual because it's mentioned here. Maybe he died of an illness, or maybe he was killed for something. But he died before the move of Terah and his family out of this area. The family had been living in Ur, and Ur has been found through archaeological diggings. It was an important cultural center of the Sumerians, where education, religion, and science flourished. It was probably a seaport, but due to silt washing down the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the site of Ur today is 130 miles inland. But this family, from what we know, was from a highly civilized area. The British Museum in London has a number of artifacts from Ur. But as these go more to the narrative of Abraham, we won't have a look at them just now. Abram and Nahor also married. Abram married Sarai, and we're going to discover that Sarai is Abram's half-sister. Same father, different mother, although it makes it interesting that she's referred to at the end of this text as his son Abram's wife, rather than his own daughter. Sarai and her later name Sarah come from a word meaning princess. And by the way, the fact that they were only half-brother, half-sister, we know that Terah had at least 2 wives. Nahor married Milcah. Milcah was Haran's daughter, so Nahor married his niece. Milcah means queen. Sarai, though, was barren. She had no children. And Terah took his family, Abram, Lot, Sarai, and they migrated to Haran, not to be confused with Lot's father. In fact, it would probably be spelled Charan and pronounced Haran rather than Haran. But the intention, at least God's intention, was that they moved to Canaan. He's setting a stage for later on. But they don't quite get that far. They ended up settling in Haran. We learned a bit more about all of this from Stephen's history lesson to the Jews in the book of Acts. Here's what Stephen told them. Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our forefather Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he settled in Haran, and said to him, "Go out from your country and from your relatives and come to the land I will show you." Then he went out from the country of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After his father died, God made him move to this country where you now live. Haran was about 600 miles northwest of Ur in the Fertile Crescent route to Canaan. It would have been several months' journey to travel from Ur up to Haran. The family settled in Haran, their new home. Joshua 24 verse 2 tells us that Terah served other gods. Ur was the center of the worship of the moon god, and Haran was as well. So maybe they brought that with them. Or if it was already there, that may have been why they ended up staying in Haran. Here's what Joshua said at the end of his life. Joshua told all the people, "Here is what the Lord God of Israel says. In the distant past, your ancestors lived beyond the Euphrates River, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor. They worshipped other gods." And the text back in Genesis tells us that Terah died in Haran at the age of 205. Some interesting chronological features here in Genesis chapter 11. Now, according to Stephen, Abraham left Haran after Terah died. The text in Genesis seems to imply this as well. Yet the text in Genesis stated when Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. That would seem to imply that Abram was the eldest and that all were born before he was 70. I don't think that's actually the case, because we will learn that Abram left Haran at the age of 75. That's in Genesis 12, verse 4. So he must have been born when Terah was around 130 years old. It would seem then that possibly Abram was not the eldest, but could be the youngest. At this stage, I don't know if we're ever told the order of the sons or not. We should be learning, though, that the order in the text is not necessarily the order of their ages. We saw that with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's not their order. William Smith suggested that Haran was the oldest, then Nahor, then Abraham, and that the order in the text here is in the order of what he called dignity. It's Abram who's going to be the important one as we continue. Nahor, secondarily important because his descendants will be brought into the narrative for Isaac as well. It would seem that Terah possibly began having children when he was 70, which was rather late in comparison to the others before him. That brings us to the end of the text. I think there's some lessons that we can learn from this. I've found this interesting, this comparison of Babel and Pentecost. Pentecost, in a sense, was Babel in reverse. Quote here, which I thought was good. My apologies for not having the citation of where it came from. I'm not sure where I got it. It wasn't in my notes, and I tried to find it, but I was unable to do so. But this quote says, "At Babel, God confused the languages to eliminate the ability to unite to do wrong. In Jerusalem on Pentecost, God clarified the languages so that all could hear the wonderful news of the gospel. Zephaniah wrote in his prophecy, 'For then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they may all call on the name of the Lord to serve him with one accord.'" Interesting. Another lesson. The Sumerian epics saw the diversity of languages as undesirable by their gods because men couldn't join together to worship them. Genesis, though, shows that the confusing of languages was a divine antidote to human arrogance. Also, the Sumerian literature depicts humans as improving, while Genesis sees what was going on as a deterioration in society. We also see here a lesson for us. God is the one who can make a person's name great, as he promised Abraham and David. The people were here, though, in Babel, were attempting to usurp God's divine privilege. I would suggest that we need to learn the lesson of Babel. What we think will be a monument to our ability can become a cause for divine judgment on us, a folly that others will see and recognize for what it is. Another quote, which I don't know who said it, the Tower of Babel was intended to be a monument to human effort. Instead, it became a reminder of divine judgment on human pride and folly. Another lesson: we cannot take on our Creator. We can't fight against him. It's futile. He is all-powerful. And one last lesson for us. There's an interesting parallel between this introduction to Babel and the subsequent histories relating to Babylon. Babylon is seen in Scripture as the embodiment of human pride and godlessness, which God brings judgment upon, both here in Genesis, later in Isaiah and Jeremiah, and especially in Daniel chapters 4 and 5. God confused the languages of the people and ensured that they came out of Babel. Isaiah called for God's people to flee Babylon. And we see this again in Revelation, where God's people are once again called to come out of Babylon because she would be destroyed. She would receive God's judgment. And this concludes our study of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We may be looking at the continuing narrative later in later lessons. They'll be on this YouTube channel and some of them on the British Bible School's YouTube channel. Mark Hill has indicated an interest in teaching about Abraham. And if he does, then my next set of lessons will be with Isaac and Jacob. So stay tuned. We may have more lessons coming from Genesis in the near future. But thank you for joining us for the study. I hope it's been profitable and hope that you can learn some things and see some things of how all this biblical narrative can fit together well with what we know historically.